If you've ever had to jump through bureaucratic hoops just to do a perfectly normal job like trimming nails, braiding hair, or being a florist and thought, why is this so complicated? If so, then today's book just might be for you. Today, I'll be reviewing The Licensing Racket by Rebecca Haw Allensworth. Welcome to Spencer Reads Everything. I'm your host, Spencer Duncan, and today we're pulling back the curtain on a quietly powerful system that affects millions of workers in the United States, whether they realize it or not. The licensing system, specifically the mess that is state-based occupational licensing. And the book that breaks it down is The Licensing Racket by Rebecca Haw Allensworth. I first heard about this book on the Freakonomics podcast, which, if you know, often dives into the weird and overlooked corners of policy and economics. And they did a whole episode on occupational licensing that mentioned this book specifically. It was a significant part of the research and the authors that they consulted to get some background information. And I was certainly intrigued by what I heard. I will say this book does an excellent job at laying out for you some of the challenges. And so what started for me as a curiosity, by the end certainly turned into a little bit of frustration, even maybe some outrage, and maybe some appreciation for how well this book presented the issue at hand. The Licensing Racket is a deep dive into how occupational licensing works, or more accurately, how it really doesn't work for American workers. Nearly 25% of all US workers today need a government-issued license to legally do their jobs. That's compared to just 5% in the 1950s. But this growth hasn't made us safer necessarily. It's made it harder for people to work, especially those on the margins. The author explains how licensing boards are often controlled by people who work in the very industries they're supposed to regulate. These insiders set the rules, and so they decide who can join the profession, and they often design barriers to protect their own interests. And that necessarily the public's. And so she gives example after example, and honestly, each one is in some cases more absurd than the previous one. And here are just a few that really stuck with me. For example, in Louisiana, you need a license to become a florist. You must pass a written and practical exam, grading you on your ability to arrange flowers. And guess who scores the test? Your competitors. Meanwhile, in every other state, people seem to be arranging bouquets without triggering mass carnage just fine. So why Louisiana? That's the whole point of this book, is to illustrate some of those absurdities. In Nevada, music therapists need 1,200 hours of clinical training and must pass a national exam, whereas a bus driver can get certified in just 15 hours of instruction. One of these people drives a 10-ton vehicle with kids in the back, and the other plays guitars for wellness. Again, I don't exactly think that makes a whole lot of sense, at least the way she presents it. In Tennessee, natural hair braiders, who were often Black women practicing a tradition passed down through generations, were required to complete 300 hours of cosmetology training, none of which actually covered the braiding in which they had generations of experience in doing. And this is a classic example of licensing requirements that actively exclude communities under the guise of public safety. In Pennsylvania, a woman was denied a manicurist license because of a decades-old felony conviction. Even though she had already served her sentence, she had been rehabilitated and completed training, the state licensing board blocked her from working. And these kinds of decisions very frequently disproportionately affect people trying to re-enter society after incarceration. Of course, it doesn't stop there. In many states, interior designers or auctioneers, bartenders, animal control officers, and even fortune tellers must have licenses. But there's little to no evidence that these requirements improve safety or outcomes. The book dives into why this system has grown so out of control. Licensing boards are often self-regulated, filled with current practitioners, and protected by state authority. That makes them powerful and hard to challenge, legally and politically. They can raise fees and limit competition and control who gets to work. And because they're shielded from antitrust laws by state action, it's nearly impossible to hold them accountable. Allensworth also walks us through the legal side of things. She explains how North Carolina Board of Dental Examiners versus FTC, a 2015 Supreme Court case, opened the door to some antitrust scrutiny, but it didn't go nearly far enough. The boards still hold enormous power, and reform efforts are patchy at best. I'd say, to the credit of the author, she doesn't just diagnose the problem, she does explore some solutions, which in a book of this nature is frequently one of the shortcomings although there's always more to be explored about possible solutions. For example, she demonstrates that some states are experimenting with universal licensing recognition in a place like Arizona so that professionals licensed in one state can work in another. Others are looking at sunrise and sunset provisions to periodically evaluate whether a license is necessary. But again, progress is slow, largely because entrenched professions lobby hard to keep the barriers high. My personal reaction to this book is that I found it to be one of those books that slowly rewires the way you see everyday life. It's not necessarily flashy or emotional, but it is quietly, if not devastating, at the very least challenging. I didn't really have any idea how pervasive and arbitrary these licensing requirements had become, or how much harm they could cause in some cases. I had heard some of these examples. I think the one about the hair braiding was one that I'd heard several times, probably in reference again to Freakonomics at some point, or at some point maybe on Planet Money, I had heard this issue. But to see it laid out, and especially given numbers, the fact that nearly 1 in 4, that just seems so much higher, and I think she does an excellent job at demonstrating how impactful that could be. What I appreciated most is how Allensworth combines her rigorous legal analysis with real life stories. That always makes for a good journalistic approach to telling something like this. She gives you the constitutional framework and the economic theory as well as the lobbying incentives, but she also makes you care by using individuals. And these are people that are just trying to work, and they're trying to support their families, and they're getting blocked by systems that are supposedly designed to protect the public, but in reality, they're just designed to protect the people that are already in power. And I know that may not sound all that true when you're thinking of licensing for something like a manicurist. You're like, how is that necessarily all that powerful? But even in terms of relativity, that is protecting someone that is in power. The person that has some kind of state-sanctioned ability to limit who can do something, even if you don't necessarily think of them as a well-off or a powerful lobby or anything like that, there still is certainly a sense of power dynamics. I also appreciate how nuanced the author is. She's not saying all licenses are bad. Of course, we want surgeons and pilots and engineers to meet standards, but we don't need a 500-hour course and 3 exams for someone to shampoo your hair. And so the book makes a clear distinction between genuine public safety regulations, and I should say, one of the things that she points out is how those should be much more dependent specifically on regulatory bodies that are owned and controlled by states or the federal government, and not something that has so much crossover and so much connection between the two, those that are practicing it and the state, because that is where you get the major conflicts of interest. She is much more interested in arguing against the protectionist gatekeeping, and I think that that is really what makes this a rather effective book. That being said, who is this book for? Well, I say that it is for readers who enjoy questions about public policy as well as economics, again referencing where I first heard about this, as well as what types of legal reform could make people's lives better, easier, and safer. Or any exploration of systems that structure our daily lives, especially systems that you may not think about. So if you're interested in books like Evicted or Poverty by America or The Color of Law, you'll find this just as eye-opening, albeit focused on a more niche, but I think an equally impactful system. It's also essential reading for, I think, really any lawmaker or journalist or activist or employers who want to better understand the invisible forces that are shaping the American workforce. Who is this book not for? Well, if you're looking for narrative nonfiction with, a strong story arc, that is certainly not here. This book may not be for you. It's not a memoir or a thriller. It's deeply researched, and it's certainly policy-driven work. But if you're willing to follow the threads, I think you will be rewarded. Obviously, as you can tell, based off of this review, there is a certain political persuasion that may not be interested in this, but I'm not entirely sure who that would be if you are not part of a larger lobbying group in one shape or another already, whether you even would make that concession or not. But overall, I certainly think it's worth the read. I would say that the Licensing Racket is one of the most quietly powerful books that I have read this year, because it's very smart, it's focused, and it's in many ways necessary as we consider what changes we might want to see in our workforce as we are constantly concerned about the accelerating rate of change. What are some of the things that might affect it? Things we don't necessarily think about. I would say this book it's probably not going to make you cry. It's not a tearjerker, but it might make you a bit angry. And sometimes that's exactly what a good book should do. Of course, I'd like to know what you guys thought about this book if you've read it, or if you're now interested in reading it based off this review, or if you're also a fan of free economics and you had some kind of reaction to it, please let me know in the comments. I'd love to keep the conversation going. But don't forget to like, subscribe, turn on those notifications, and until next time, keep those pages turning.